the prophet figure does continue from a book of changes. There's a prophet figure, and then there's like anything but human. It's kind of like an Easter egg lah for the like two fans I have, or like yeah.
Hello, welcome back to another episode of Sploosh. So today we are interviewing Daryl Lim, the author of A Book of Changes and most recently Anything But Human, which was nominated for the Singapore Literature Prize last year. It's been a long time since we last interviewed someone. We're also joined by Anurak Selau, who will introduce himself later. Daryl will introduce himself later as well. So today we'll talk about a few of Daryl's books and also just like general themes, like history and also like contemporary concerns. Yeah, so without further ado, would you like to introduce yourself? Anurak first, maybe.
Hi, my name is Anurak. I think that's it.
Oh yeah, okay. Hi everyone. Yeah, this is the first time I'm doing something like this, I think. Well, maybe. But I'm Daryl. I think of myself primarily as a poet, but I also edit, translate, write criticism. And very happy to be here today. Although I think I was an hour late because of confusion. But I should also I will help Anurak sort of introduce himself a little bit. He's a great poet, and his poetry was just recently published in New Singapore Poetries, which is quite a milestone volume of Singaporean poetry. Yeah, so very excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for introducing yourselves. So I think to start off, let's just start with Anything But Human to dive into other topics as well. I think something that's quite striking for Anything But Human, especially for me as a reader, right, is how unfamiliar the language feels. Because with other poems, right, or other poetry collections, the poems are quite cohesive, quite coherent to get what it's trying to say, right? There's like a message or meaning behind it. Whereas with Anything But Human, it's like the meaning is suspended. And also like very recently, I read a collection of translated works, translated Chinese poetry. And that really reminded me of Anything But Human, because like Anything But Human, it kind of reads also like translated works, you know? It's like the meaning is kind of mediated of sorts. So like, do you want to explain this defamiliarization of the language?
I'm not sure I can. I think maybe I can think of, sort of contextualize it and maybe in terms of like my writing journey lah. Like I think I started off the first book, which is A Book of Changes, which was like, wow, it's like seven years ago now, which was published. And definitely like I started writing maybe a decade ago. That was very like, in some ways, straightforward poems, in the sense of if you read them, you kind of know what they were going on about. They were about historical episodes, you know, they were in some ways, some of them were didactic, some of them were just having fun. But it was like very coherent in that sort of way. And I think I got a bit tired of that, or rather it felt like I needed to push the boundaries of like language a little bit more. And so I think that's how the genesis of how Anything But Human came about. In a way, it was trying to depart from myself. Yeah.
Were there like influences that moved you in that direction?
Wow. I think a lot. I think certainly like people like Wong Mei and Wong Pui Nam, who are two pioneering sort of Singaporean Malaysian poets, had a big thing to do with it. So Wong Mei, I think, taught me like how to use space to sort of break up the flow of words on a page, which was quite instructive lah. And you can see I deployed that technique quite a lot. And the idea was to sort of do that also in my translations. Yeah. So she did that. I think Wong Pui Nam, by way of trying to use images and symbols that don't necessarily explain themselves. And that's what he's very good at. So in a way, myth and symbols don't have to explain themselves. They sort of are what they are. So those two people were influential.
How about Chinese poetry? Because the epigraph is a quote from a Chinese poem, right? And also there are many translations of Bai Ji. So like, maybe you could talk about the influences of Chinese poetry or Chinese literature.
Yeah. So the epic, actually, so the title of the book is from a poem. It's actually from a poem not by me. It's by this lady called Wang Xiaoni. She's like a contemporary Chinese poet. And she in some ways reminds me of Wong Mei as well, because her images are kind of like frenzied, frantic, very interior. Kind of this like mindscape of her own, where she's like this sort of struggling person. And her language really struck me, both in Chinese, but also because I read it in like side-by-side translation. And I really love her work. And so she has been a huge influence. After finding her, because she's translated in this series of work by Zephyr Press, where they basically publish Chinese poems and then English poems side by side. I sort of sought out more Chinese poets, contemporary Chinese poets, and I think they are actually been a huge influence. Contemporary Chinese poets. I think the way they use images and language has been so inventive, so that's been big for me. And I think because I can read the original Chinese, it adds another layer of meaning. Yeah. The Pai Chi stuff is a bit of a departure. Maybe we talk about it later. But yeah, it is because Pai Chi is like a Tang dynasty poet. It's like 1500 years ago. So it's a bit different. Because his language is actually very plain and simple. He intended his poetry to be able to be like easily understood. So it almost acts as a contrast or a palette cleanser in the second section of the book.
I think that's quite interesting as well because there's also another palette cleanser in the first half of the book, The Fly Forgotten as a Dream. And I just learned from Anurak that comes from a hymn, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so like both of them come from like really long ago texts. So as if they are sources of meaning because maybe they're constructed at a time when meaning was still like very stable, right? Compared to now where definitions run amok, like many things can be defined in many ways. So like was there an intention to like rely on texts from long ago to like ground this collection?
In a way, I think it's more because I'm a bit of a magpie, I guess. Like, poetically, I sort of just like grab stuff that I find interesting. So, I mean, the book is quite eclectic in that sense, right? Because, like, basically there's like a reference to a hymn, which is The Fly Forgotten as a Dream. I can't remember what the hymn is called, but basically the story of that is like that phrase from that hymn struck me. Because the hymn is like hymns are quite like positive, you know, like we will all be safe, sort of thing. And then, but that line was very weird because it says, "They fly forgotten as a dream dies at the opening day," I think, which is a weirdly like bleak phrase. So I was like struck by it. So these weird things where things jut out and don't make sense. And sort of like it's like a fissure in like text or stuff like that. Yeah. They strike me, so I just pick them up.
Yeah, I mean, like your magpie reference is actually, I think, quite topical, because it brings to mind, at least for me, the idea of the poet as a translator, as a kind of machine for gathering these inputs and then structuring them into some kind of output which is not necessarily related. And I'm reminded of, as Hao Yang mentioned just now, ChatGPT. And the way that there's this interest in the weird neural processes that drive, formation of language artificially and, in humans. Yeah. And I know that you did start a kind of Instagram account related to that. Can you tell us a bit more about,
I'm not sure there's much to talk about for that. So there was a Instagram account I started called Anything But Human, which is meant to be, I think, kind of like, in some ways it's a self-parody. I mean, in many ways, it's a self-parody. It's kind of like, but the idea was to feature like singlit classics. So I review like Evan Thambu, Wong Mei, Wong Pui Nam, Robert Yeo. But the idea was to give like captions or book reviews that didn't really make sense. They were not about the book at all. They were like, and basically it's this taking this idea of generated language to an extreme.
Yeah, I mean, I know this is a consistent thread of like interest in weird nonsensical language. Like even in Food Republic, you anthologize the food reviews from was it Omote or Sushiro? Yes. Which, I mean, yeah, tell us more about that.
I think the impulse comes from the fact that I like to find poetry in things that people wouldn't think of as poetry. So there's like there's, for example, what you just said about for Food Republic, which is this book on food that I co-edited with some folks, Anne and Hao Guang. We decided to ask this restaurant, they were coming up with like fantastical, like Baroque descriptions of Japanese food. They're really quite funny. And so we decided to ask them if we could feature their social media post as poetry. And actually this was the genesis of the book, because Hao Guang and I were debating if these were considered poems or not. And then we said, let's do a food poem book. And then this is what happened. Yeah. And the idea is like, it's that, but also like, if you look at anything but human, there's like, I mean, you wouldn't know it, but there are things which are basically quotes. They're like taken from things I hear, from people talking, brochures, pamphlets. There's a poem actually that I didn't include in the book, but it's basically it's found text from from a condominium brochure. So it's like these weird, like oddly poetic things come up in everyday life where you don't expect. Yeah.
Which brings us to the whole notion of what this desert of the real, right? It's like you're in a landscape of language which is like debris or like flotsam, and you're just picking and choosing this and constructing it into the anthology itself or the collection itself.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think in many ways it kind of like disturbs the idea of, I'm not the first person to do this for sure, but it disturbs the idea of like the author as the sole author of the poem. And maybe that's what ties like the prestige of like established authors who I know, and also like authors that we don't know, like the people who wrote the condo brochure, the people who like wrote terrible copy. So it's like it's a mishmash of like of authorship stuff. So I think that the thought that I'm a translator is a good one. Like I'm not necessarily a creator in and of myself, although I am, but that's not the only role I play. But also the idea of being a chatbot, right? which is apt that you brought it up, because it's like kind of like the chatbot brings together things and makes it better somehow. Yeah.
I recognize like a sort of democratic spirit to this, because you're like identifying like poetry in everyday language. Asserting that the author isn't like the writer isn't the sole author of the text, right? But I think a possible critique of anything but human or like poems like this is also that it could be rather inaccessible to the masses, right? So what would you say would be is there an ideal reader in mind, or how should people approach such texts?
That's an interesting one. It's quite interesting you mentioned that, because I was just reading about, because last year was like the 100th anniversary of like the Wasteland, right? Yeah, and the Wasteland is often thought of as like this very high modernist text, with very baroque and ornate references. But actually what T.S. Eliot thought he was doing, and I don't know how many people agree, but what he thought he was doing was actually doing, in some ways, not that different from what I think I'm doing, right? He was bringing in voices from the street, all these more like pop culture things, which I think people would have been horrified at, or conservatives in his age would have been horrified at. So I don't see it as that different from what he's doing. So maybe just like, yeah, on that note, yeah. But the ideal reader, I don't know. Maybe I don't think about ideal readers, but I think anyone who's interested in not taking language at what's the word? Well, sorry, I've just woken up, I think. But at face value, sorry, not taking language at face value. Yes, that's the phrase. Yeah, people who don't want to take language at face value should read this book. And I think it's also, I think the other thing is about like, if you ever thought that in some ways language was always like very deceptive, like the words you use to describe things, the moment you try to describe them, they kind of like mislabel things already. As you go along, you continue this fiction. I think if you're uncomfortable with language as a representation of like what is real, you should read this book. Sorry, that's like the worst sell ever. But let's go along with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's this O'Hara line, I think, in Having a Coke with You, where he says something like, "There are no faces in the paintings, just paint," or something like that. And I feel that you draw attention to language as like the medium of communication as opposed to what's being signified.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah, it is all pain. But I mean, it's not in a way, it's not, and maybe we can talk about this as we go along. It's not like a cynical or completely dispirited thing. It's not pessimistic. Yeah, the book is not a pessimistic book, although I think people might think it is, but it's not actually. It's actually quite celebratory in the sense of or it's equal parts celebration and disgust. It's kind of, it aims to be in that place between all things, where it's neither like pessimistic nor optimistic. It kind of revels and celebrates, but also is disgusted, condemns. Yeah, isn't that in-between spot of ambivalence.
Do you compare yourself to like the role of prophet in like, because there are poems about prophets, right? In both, I think, A Book of Changes and Anything But Human. So have you seen yourself as a prophet when you write?
Oh, you're like super observant, yeah. The prophet figure does continue from A Book of Changes. There's a prophet figure, and then there's like Anything But Human. It's kind of like an Easter egg lah for the like two fans that I have.
The two friends in this room.
Yeah, but actually, there's a long story to this. Is the prophet figure is actually Wong Pui Nam. He's kind of, I imagine things in his voice, as it were, because he's kind of like a grandfather poet figure to me. I don't really think of myself as a prophet, because I think poetry cannot prophesize anything. But the idea of a prophet is interesting to me, because in some ways the prophets emerge when things have gone wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like when the landscape is shattered, when like stuff has gone wrong, they kind of emerge to tell you like there's something wrong, and to tell you what to expect. So I kind of like the idea of that.
I think T.S. Eliot was kind of embodied that role as well, right? In Wasteland.
Exactly, the Tiresias, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I was a bit like, in some ways, pleased, but also like very disappointed that in some ways people like me and the Anything But Human hasn't quite escaped from like the gaze of T.S. Eliot or like or the like influence of T.S. Eliot. Because like in many ways everyone says that like modern poetry or contemporary poetry is still footnotes to Eliot. When I realized this, I was like a bit depressed. But also amazed that Eliot has so much influence and sway over us still.
I think something that also fascinated me in Anything But Human is the recurring motif of discounts. Like, what drew you to discounts?
Discounts, that's a good one. Yeah. In some ways, there is a strand of the book which I think we all would have picked up on, where it's actually I won't say commentary, but it's about, I hate this term, but I'm forced to use it. It's about late capitalism. It is this idea that, that in some ways, we have all accepted that capitalism is the most logical and coherent way of organizing ourselves that everyone accepts and there's no alternative to it. But at the same time, it's a system that produces ridiculous outcomes and like absurdities. And that's where discounts come in, I think. Because discounts are kind of a recurrent feature of the system. But to the point that it's actually absurd that such things exist. And I mean, now it's even more absurd because you have stuff like 11, 11, 12, 12. It's almost like a regular cycle of discounts, and yet we still fall for it. So I think that's the aspect where the idea of discounts and sales is like points you towards the absurdity of the system, and yet we still believe in it, or we still partake in it joyfully, right? So that's one aspect. Then I think, of course, Singapore is kind of like the center of discounts. Like we invented like the Great Singapore Sale, we invented all these things about discounts. We perfected some arts of selling, right? So it's kind of interesting to think about that in that way.
And I think in some ways, the collection is somewhat at least colored by the time it was written in. The references, at least passingly, to retrovirals and antibiotics and COVID and so on. How much was the experience of writing it in I assume at least part of it over 2020, 2021. How much did that like color the anthology, the collection?
No, that's a good question. And funnily enough, I'm going to tell you that actually most of it was written before COVID, yeah. Which just took a while to get to publication. So there are a few poems there which were written during COVID that I added in, but there are like 3 or 4 poems. Most of it was before. So maybe it is prophetic. Yeah, in the sense of it predicted COVID, but it was too late to predict it. It came out in like 2021. The obsession with viruses and viral, I think, comes, with an awareness of, my own awareness of HIV and AIDS epidemic. And the idea of medicine, I think, was as a strand that goes through not throughout the book, but there is a sense of it. Because I think the idea of disease and sickness is kind of what undermines this idea of modernist perfection. So you can't engineer your way out of everything. Eventually you will die, you'll fall sick and die or something. So the idea of illness is something that we haven't been able to conquer, right? So it is the thing that still, I think, reminds us that we are human. So it creeps up a lot towards the end of the first section. Because that's where it comes to an end. In a way, there's arc, right? And it comes to an end. And sickness and illness is where it comes in to remind us of our mortality. Sorry, this is very like cliche, but that is the road that it's.
The memento mori.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But also, I think the reminder that we have failed to master it still in some ways, despite our best attempt.
And I guess, I mean, for me, that kind of brings me to the thread of who the poet or the persona is as a persona. Which, then again, we have to cover credo as a piece where you try and explain yourself. Or at least the persona tries to explain himself.
Yes. Do we talk about credo?
We can.
Okay, just to explain to our viewers, Credo is the poem that... Oh, no, actually, no. It's the second last poem of the book. But it's the only, I think, longish poem that stretches over four or five pages, right? Yeah. It is unlike the rest of the book. It is... I don't know how you all would think, but it sort of is straightforward in the sense of it's just a series of I believe statements. So I believe in this, I believe in that. And Credo, of course, in Latin means I believe. It was the genesis of this... So the book originally didn't have this poem. It came in as quite a late edition. And it was basically after review from Larry Yipio. So, some of you have heard the story, but Larry said to me that your book is great, but it lacks like a punch at the end. It lacks like... You need to go out with a bang. You can't go out with a whimper. That's TSL again. But anyway... and I took him on and I basically wrote a long poem because he said you need to write a long poem. So it was very painful to write a long poem. I never write long poems, so this is what happened. And if I were to analyze my own self and my own text, I would say it is, in a way, I think is addressed to people who might feel like the book is an intimidating book or like it doesn't explain itself sufficiently. Right, it's kind of like, okay, so who are you after all of this? Where are you? What do you believe in? So it tries to answer that, but of course doesn't. Because I could never do that. I could never sincerely tell people what I believe. But so it's an admixture of like false statements, of some real statements of what things I believe, some absurd statements of things that I believe. And it's in some ways as far as I'm willing to go to reveal myself in the book.
Could you take us through the ending of that poem?
Sure. Okay, maybe I just read out the line before. I believe that time is running out. There was too much anyway. And as the handsome bot on my Facebook tells me, time is like a pig knife. Good night. What do you want to know about this ending?
Why end it this way?
So factually, this is something a handsome bot on my Facebook feed said to me. Time is like a pig knife. Good night. So again, there's the magpie nature of it. But I thought it was both an amazing way to end because it's kind of... It addressed the issue I was talking about, which is time. Yeah. And it also didn't answer anything. Because time is like a pig knife, doesn't mean anything. Oh, maybe it does, I don't know. And it speaks to what we were talking about, the idea of bottishness and humanness. And is it what is he saying? But at the same time, does it matter? Yeah.
And for some reason, I'm reminded of Hamlet. Because ham and pig and also the whole good night, sweet prince thing.
Oh wow, I didn't think of that, but nice. We can just say it was in there. Yeah. Larry read it because I gave him the book after a while. He hadn't read this poem. And he called it a generous gesture to the reader, which I think I sort of agree with. Yeah. So I think of it as it's my generous like peacemaking offer. If you hated the book, maybe you'll like this. This will at least save your $21. Or at least make you feel that your $21 is worth it. It also, I think it has been a convenient poem because it's the easiest poem to like get people to understand what the book's about. I think it's like the gateway.
Is it? Actually, I thought the gateway was kind of like definition. I thought definition was the one that made me think, okay, so like there's this obsession with meaning, and how it's like if everything can mean something in so many different ways, then what does this thing truly mean? It's like, I feel like that was the gateway to the collection for me. Definition.
Yeah, it's a very short poem.
Right.
It just,
it's just like
I can even read it out actually.
Yeah, you can.
Definition is a prion, folding what used to be sense into madness. Yeah, that's it. It's more interesting on a page though, because there are like spaces to contend with. But sorry, you were saying? Oh, it was the gateway. Another late edition. I took it out, put it back in at the end, because I thought, okay, yeah, I need a poem that basically explains, I think, what we were just talking about, where in some ways, naming and languaging things actually distorts it. So yeah, that's part of it.
There's another poem I'm also very interested in because I used to be a huge fan of Dvorak's music. And then there's a poem called New World Symphony, right? So were you inspired by the symphony itself? Or?
I was. Is this, if you listen to the New World Symphony, you really believe a new world is on the making, is on the verge of being formed, yeah. Which is what the second part is about. Yeah, the second part is about a new world being formed. So I thought I had to reference that. Yeah.
Another thing is also like, there's a recurring form that's used right in junk space rhapsodies and carnivorous reveries. So could you guys through that form?
It's actually a pantoum.
But it's not a proper pantoum, right?
I think it sort of is. I mean, there's no real... Yeah, I mean, it is a pantoum, I think. Which is derived from, of course, the traditional Malay form, the pantun. Again, I learned this from John Yao. John Yao, who's this Asian American poet. He uses it to great effect. And I was very stunned when I first saw his pantoums. So I thought, how can I use the pantoum to similarly do that? It is a bit different. You're right in that it's different because it changes a little bit from each line to line. Yeah, and that was my adaptation of it.
The slipperiness of language,
but also of like perspective, because basically the perspectives and the meanings change a little bit as it develops. So when it's repeated again, it's often not the same line. Yeah, and that was the idea. I use it actually in Junk Space Rhapsodies, which is about in a shopping mall, really. Because it is the form that helps me give the sense of like dizzying repetition, which you often find in malls or shopping spaces. So that was the intended effect, I think.
I think to wrap up the discussion on anything but human, right? What do you think writing it has done for you, intellectually or psychologically?
Wow, that's a big question.
Because, for example, for like confessional poets, right? Some of them maybe write to answer questions for themselves or to overcome trauma, right? So, but this is clearly not confessional in the confessional sense. So, what has writing anything but human done for you?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yeah, I guess you're right in that. Like for confessional poets, it helps them at least reckon or deal with a episode, right? Yeah. And then they can may not move on, but at least they have dealt with it. They have exhausted that well. I think for me it was very important to write this because it sort of established. I felt myself having quite a distinct voice, I think, in the book. Or which is a weird thing to say because it's actually such a disparate book. Yeah. But in some ways, this feels like the most like me that I've ever written. Which is funny to say again because it's only my second book. But I think it felt like I had come up with something that I was very happy with as a representation of who I am. I think the first book was that, but I felt it was in some ways less secure in itself, yeah. I was like quite secure in it. So it was important for me to have written it. Yeah. And I think first time can be an accident. The second time you publish a book of poems, it felt like, okay, yeah, you are kind of a poet, I guess. So in that sense, I think it was important for my identity, self-identity as a poet. Yeah, that this was real for me. I think also it helped me get over, I think that's why the book has a first and second half. The first half is sort of writing yourself into a sort of rut. And then the second half tries to free yourself from that sort of rut. So it was a process of trying to reinvent myself as well. So it was important to have written that, yeah.
So would you continue writing in this style?
I don't think so, yeah. And I feel like I might be the sort of poet who kind of like, each book is a new sort of voice or new direction. Maybe there are continuities of like voice between each book, but like it's an attempt to reinvent yourself somewhat. So I think I might be that sort of poet, but it's hard to tell. So I think of it as two types of poets. One type of poet essentially writes the same book, but like differently, or same voice. There's a continuity of voice.
Anyone in mind?
And this is not criticism, by the way. It's because they often write better and like more evolved versions of the book. So Cyril Wong is someone I think of in that light, and I think he's done it like better and better each time. there are some departures lah. So people would say Satori Blues is kind of a bit of a departure, but generally the story holds. It's kind of like one book, not one book, but different versions of the book. Or they're very similar themes. The other kind of poet kind of like writes a different book each time, and it's like almost a departure in different ways. Yeah. I would say I've heard Alvin Pang describe himself in that way. I don't know if that, I haven't really thought about whether that is truly representative of how he writes, but I think he's someone in that ballpark. So I'm thinking I might be more of the second, but it's too early to say lah.
To rise is often to stumble into a new beginning. Consider the sun peeking out from a pink horizon. But new days can also bring new anxieties, sea levels, costs of living, the tension between two people. For our inaugural magazine issue, we invite you to submit work that engages with the notion or the motion of rising, from a bed, from a fall, or from the waters. Texts that float and bob, that uncurl like a cobra or unfurl like a flag. We'll keep our heads turned skywards. We pay $10 for poems and art, and $20 for prose and creative non-fiction. Submit your works now to splooshsg@gmail.com. The deadline is 31st of March 2023.
We could talk about your first book just briefly. It's your debut collection, right?
Yes.
And just wondering why choose to make historical concerns the crux of your debut collection as a poet.
Oh, I guess there's one very practical one in which I was actually coming back from having done like a history bachelor's and master's like consecutively. So I was in that space of historical inquiry. So I was thinking about academic history. I enjoyed it. I was good at it, I guess. And then, and I sort of had done a thesis and everything. And it was kind of like entering the poetry world. That was my sort of bridge lah, from the world of history to the world of poetry. And I started thinking about what can you use poetry to talk about? How can you use poetry to talk about history to illuminate it in ways that academia can't? So that is, in some ways, where the book is situated.
There's a poem in the collection about the race riots, right? On 21st July 1964.
Yes.
So how is it to write a poem about an event with such like historical gravity, with like lives lost and political implications?
It was not that difficult in a way because the entry point was my own family. Because it really started off with the story that my grandpa told me, that basically during the race riots he lived nearby. He was like in Kallang area, which is actually where I started. Yeah, Kallang Geylang area, and the kampong was there. So he basically fled with my mom in his arms, because she was a toddler then. So just running away, and then I believe then he sheltered with a family, a Malay family actually, in another kampong, something like that. Yeah, and so that is the central thread that goes through that sequence of poems, and it's helps because in some ways the book also tries to like tie different levels of history together, right? Of time. So there's like national history, and like there's family history. There's like global geographic history. And so that it was trying to tie my family's history to like a national historical event.
So was Last Rites inspired by an actual event?
Last Rites is the last poem, right? Of the book. Last Rites, it is a bit about NS, I think. Yeah. So partly there's some NS experience. I don't know if I would have ended the book on the same sequence now. Yeah, it was kind of a last minute choice. And maybe one that I'm not the most happy with. I don't think it sets the right tone, but to end the book on. But yeah, I mean, it's there.
I did think it mirrored the poem that opened the collection quite nicely though, because the poem that opens the collection kind of gives you that juxtaposition of like really grand historical events and also like really minute events, right? And then in Last Rites, it's also like just suddenly just zooming in on a very possibly historically insignificant event like the death of someone, but in the context of an actual person, right, he would experience it in a huge way, for example. So I think it mirrored the opening quite well, in my opinion.
That's great. I love the retrospective coherence that you are imposing on it. But it's great because, I mean, to be honest, I think I would have done that poem differently. But I mean, Yeah.
So which period in history fascinates you the most? I know I'm also like history obsessed though.
Yes, you are. I studied the Renaissance.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the studied the Renaissance. Particularly like Renaissance philosophy and art in Europe and around Europe. So that was where I started off on. But actually, if you ask me now, what I'm really interested in, I guess I've always been very interested in like Singapore's history and history of the region.
Yeah.
So that's always been my speciality. Even from before that, it's just that because I was in the UK, there weren't really experts doing it, so I didn't really specialize in it. So it didn't make sense. So that's one. Chinese history is interesting to me as well, but generally quite interested in most forms of history.
And that fascination with Singapore's history is something I also picked up on in 我师承我街道, the Chinese book. Okay, yeah. Because you talk about the history of Potong Pasir, right? And I think you were doing some research while writing that and you discovered new things. I can't remember what was it. Right. So, can you remember what new things you learned about Potong Pasir?
No, but firstly, I'm amazed. Do you read it in Chinese?
Yes.
Oh wow.
I bought the book.
Your Chinese must be very good. Because I say that because I didn't write it in Chinese. So it was translated from Chinese to English.
Yeah.
But secondly, it's in Fanti, it's in traditional Chinese script. So I'm amazed you read it. I have not read it myself in Chinese. Or at least not in Fanti. So well done. The book, the piece you talk about is about the neighborhood that I live in now, Potong Pasir. And basically it tries to construct a sort of local history of it, but not in like a coherent narrative. It's basically like vignettes of like local history. So there's like stuff about the floods in Potong Pasir, because it used to get flooded all the time. I don't know why it's not flooded now.
People drowning in like quarries or something.
Yeah. So people used to drown in the because it used to be a quarry, then it became disused. Then basically disused quarries, when there's rain and flooding, it becomes a huge pond. That's why the vegetables grew so well there. So these vegetable farms and markets there. But also why people drown there all the time, which is quite sad. So it's about trying to construct this local history, but not in a didactic or narrative sort of way, but more like little snippets, which are kind of like which you might not know about.
You talked about this temple in Yishun that has like a Ta Po Gong and some other deity, right? From another folk religion. So also in, I think, Anything But Human, there's a poem about folk religion, justifying something about folk religion, right? So is it something you've been interested in recently?
In A Book of Changes. Religion, yes. I mean, religion, I two things I'm interested in about religion. One is like kind of like informal and syncretic practice of religion. Recently, I've been very inspired by it because I actually went on a tour around the Little India area last year, and basically we were visiting what we call informal shrines. So they're not temples, but they're like basically like roadside shrines that people set up, and in some ways these shrines reflect the community that they serve. So you would have Ganesh, but you also have Wan Yin. You might have a Thai god, and it's like very cool. To me, it's like super interesting that these things are just there, and it also I think points to the fact that Singapore is actually a deeply religious place. There's a lot of religious energy about. Honestly, like people really do believe in these things, and like large or very significant and like venerable trees will attract shrines like quite naturally. So I think I'm fascinated by this informal practice of religion more so than the organized type, simply because it's less explored, and really reveals a side of Singapore that you wouldn't think would exist if you were just an outsider to it, or even if you lived here for a long time. If you don't like look at it, but actually super interesting.
You talked about venerable trees. I thought of this one tree in Toa Payoh that's really huge, and there's a shrine there. I think when I grew up, and I used to go there with my family quite often. My dad would tell me about it being like a religious place or something. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, and it's funny how they are like kind of a way. I don't know if there's the right word, but it's in a way quite democratic, because or populist, because they kind of like pop up and are maintained and kind of ebb and flow as people believe and disbelieve and buy into what these energies are, and that's how they set up shrines. So it's kind of like weird. It's almost like a spiritual map of the city. So I kind of love the idea. I would love to write about it more one day actually.
So what are you working on right now, actually?
Oh, I'm working on, what am I working on? I'm working on this book of Malaysian Singapore writing called The Second Link. So we are putting it together, me and 3 other editors from Singapore and Malaysia. So it's basically meant to like commemorate the 60th anniversary of merger. Because we merged in 1963, Singapore and Malaysia. And when I say commemorate, but really it's just these essays will reflect on the relationship between Singapore and Malaysia. So we thought about this is very important to do. So in like the last phase of editing. So I'm also working on an anthology of Wong Pui Nam's work. So Wong Pui Nam, as some of you know, died last year. So we're thinking about putting out a collection of his selected work sometime this year. This is the year of like other people's work for me, which I think is a nice change. It's like the editor role coming out more, which I think is quite fun. So less of my own work for now.
More of inane asylum.
Yes, more of inane asylum.
How did it start?
I think we should explain to our listeners. Inane asylum is basically like an Instagram hashtag that I use in my Instagram stories to catalog what I call instances of the inane asylum. And I think of Singapore basically as an inane asylum. So we are not mad, but we have a lot of inanity. We are like an inane people obsessed with inane things. So that just catalogs that. Yeah, I just thought it was funny. But yeah, it's grown to be quite a thing. Like people submit things to be catalogued on inane asylum.
What are your favorite examples?
Wow, that's a good one. There's
Wait, I love the most recent one, the drawing bakwa on the...
oh yeah. Drying pork belly on the laundry pole. Although I said that's too interesting to be on on inane asylum. But it's like what's a good one? I'm trying to think of a good example.
Remember the first inane act that started this? The first one that you captured?
I know which one it is. So there was the one that really inspired me was that there was this whole hoo-ha about this like clown, this guy dressed as a clown, loitering outside schools. Yeah. It was a tuition one. Which I guess for parents is mildly threatening, but it became a whole hoo-ha where there were like police reports and then there was like a PR fiasco. And I'm like, do you all have nothing better to do? It's only in Singapore where like I feel this thing would be like national news. And like I think Speaker Tan Chuan Jin put a Facebook post out to like reassure people that this is like we're looking into it. And I'm like, huh? I mean, come on. That was actually the first one that sparked it. I was like, wow, this is really inane. Like people surely have better things to care about.
But what do you see it doing, right? Like, is it for amusement? Is it?
It's mostly for amusement. It's mostly for amusement. But I think it's also like it's in some ways tied to the idea of like the state of anything but human, right? This idea of like modernist contentment and perfection. That you have nothing better to do. So that's it. That you sort of go mad, I think. Which is the first part of it. So I guess you can draw a link there. But it's just really for my own amusement. And community building, I guess. Because people have been submitting it to like it. So yes, please feel free to submit.
Have you read the story written by Daryl Lim in Fish Eats Diner Ducks?
Yeah.
It's so funny.
It's about a bus. A SBS bus, basically, that stops at Serangoon, at a bus stop in Serangoon, but no one departs it, and it just stays there for a few days.
And Daryl's the first to emerge from
I'm
the
the
bus
first
stop.
in this story. I'm the first to emerge. So yeah, I'm very honored. The first time I've been written into fiction, I think. Yeah.
I'm actually very interested, now that we mentioned these other names and the history of the 10-year series and that batch of poets. Tell us more about the community, about, I don't know.
So it was the starting days of like Singapore Poetry Writing Month, which I think has made the careers of, or like kickstarted the careers of many poets in Singapore, in English at least. So I was like, me and a few others were at the start of this. So people like Daryl Lim, Amanda Chong, Hao Guang, Joshua, we were at the start. And then we basically the first thing we formed was like a writing collective. And we basically just found like-minded folks to like start writing poetry together. So that's how a lot of us started off. Then I think the 10-year series, which was published by Math Paper Press, was like the first set of manuscripts that came out of this process called Manuscript Bootcamp, which Singlit Station started. It so happened that a lot of them were like people who were in that first writing group, which we call ISD, by the way. image symbol department. Yeah. Yeah, it just so happened that way. So we became quite a tight group, I think, like a few of us. And we've sort of persisted. Now we don't actually do so much workshopping. It's more like a social thing. But we sort of like comment on each other's manuscripts and stuff like that. I think it's important to have that support structure in place if you want to write.
But you all write in like pretty different styles with different consents, right? So how do you still give each other useful critique while respecting each other?
Maybe it's the best way actually. Yeah, because we are like not, in some ways, not writing in the same space. It's actually easier to give objective feedback. I'm also glad that we're not like a collective in the sense of like the futurists or something, you know what I mean? Yeah. Where they have manifestos. I think that's great because in some ways we are so different. And it's good that you have a group of people who can allow you to do something that's so different, but also give you meaningful feedback. I think that's what's nice about it. It's not competitive, it's not like workshopping in the kind of like this very like US MFA, but kind of way where it's like, you're like cutting people down to the bone. It's more like a more generous, informal form of feedback, which is great.
And on that note, what advice would you have for, younger poets?
Oh God, just read a lot. I think that's always been my advice to like everyone. So I mentor for like the creative arts program. I just have to read a lot first lah. Don't write so much. Like write minimally, read maximally. Like I think a lot of like young poets think that when they are first writing that they are like the shit. Like they're writing amazing things that no one has written before, but actually it's never true, right? Like people have written before you, they've written much better stuff. So like get exposed and then you can start.
What do you think about the state of singlit, or narrowly Singapore poetry in English?
Oh, this is a very like ponderous question. What do I think about the state? Can I just recycle one of my answers? Yeah, okay, I'll do that. I said before that I think it probably increasingly is less useful to think of Singapore poetry as Singapore poetry, just because it's been so diverse. And because I think a lot of the folks I read probably draw their inspiration from a lot of things elsewhere that they've read. So it can be communities of, let's say, queer poetry, or just other styles of or schools of poetry that they've come across. And that maybe is what the internet really does. It like kind of like allows people to form communities outside of their like national borders. So I think it's increasingly meaningless to talk about singlit. But maybe the thing I would say is that I wish that people were read outside the Anglophone centers a bit more, meaning US, UK lah, especially the US, which I feel like it's almost like people feel like it's the be all and end all of poetry, which I can see why. I mean, there's great stuff coming out of like the US, but I think attention to like two places, Southeast Asia, which actually has a surprising amount of, it may not be written originally in like English, but there's quite a lot of translation going on. I wish people read more of that. Myanmar, of course, is actually a great place for I would say inventive and quite amazing poetry. Vietnam as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on now. So I would encourage people to read outside of that and read stuff in translation, of course. So I think that will really broaden people's horizon.
There's quite little attention paid to like poetry or literature written in the other three national languages, right? Other than English.
Yes, exactly. So like even starting at home with that is important. So I've been talking about translation a lot. But just to bang the drum again, please translate more. We need to do more of that.
Okay, next. What are the biggest problems and opportunities in the field of singlit?
Oh God.
Not just writing, maybe like publishing as well.
Oh yeah.
So the general landscape.
I mean, we've always had, I think, not that many publishing houses, I guess. And now with like, it seems like books actually and math paper press have closed or are on their last legs. So that's bad. There is really no, like, if you were like a aspiring debut poet, there's really no good place to go. Not that many good places to go. So we do need more diversity of like publishers. But I think the real problem it points at maybe is just having an outfit that has really like thought it through end to end in terms of the nitty-gritty of printing, distribution, but also like I think the marketing side of it and the reaching out to readers to develop this dedicated poetry reading public, which I think exists. It's just that no one has really put them together. It used to be Math Paper Press. Math Paper Press tried to do that and did it, I think, fairly successfully. But the problem, I think, with a lot of it was that we didn't have a good like editing culture. So I was just talking about this to some friends. That actually in Singapore, I can't really think, and I'm sorry if this offends anyone, but I can't really think of someone I would think of in poetry as like a great editor. that like people like really think, oh wow, we should talk to him to get his or her or their views. So maybe the age of this kind of like heroic editorship is gone, but I think it would be nice to have more dedicated editors in the scene. But of course, it's a money problem.
Yeah, because like when I talk to published friends, they always say that like the main editors in a high end are like fellow poets, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to like dedicated editors.
Exactly. I think that is a bit of a problem. I don't know if fiction faces the same issues. Probably less so because there's more money in the sort of fiction ecosystem. And I guess it's not that much of an issue because in some ways because people also go overseas, which has worked for a few folks like Hao Yang, who's getting published in Hawaii, Ali Chua, who's getting published in Australia. But it does mean that, for example, a very good book like Hamid Raslan's book, in some ways it's very hard to imagine like a overseas publisher publishing that because it's so in some ways rooted in like Singapore and at least the Singapore and Malaysia, the sort of Malay world region, right? You want a publisher in like Singapore who understands that sort of text and kind of to bring it out. So I think that makes a case for like a local publishing.
Next questions. This one's kind of abstract. Should we all become anything but human?
The hands are also abstract, but this is particularly abstract. Yes, I agree with you. Should we become anything but human? I think we already are. In many ways, we have from the very start been quite augmented by things that are not human, and it's just become increasingly more apparent. So, hello. So we already are.
Okay, last question.
Yes.
Why bird?
Why bird?
Why bird?
Why bub?
Oh, I assume this person's referring to my pet. Yeah, I have a pet bird. I have a pet cockatiel, who's very adorable. There's no why, birds are. Therefore, birds are. But yeah, it's been a huge comfort to me because I live alone. So like having a pet is a nice way of doing things.
Why do you choose a bird though?
Why do I choose?
Yeah, like not a fish or anything else.
Well, you can't do much with fishes. Fishes are just there. You can't like pet them or like They're surprisingly actually they're really fun. So cockatiels are good because one, they are in some ways quite independent, so you can sort of let them be for a while. Of course, you should play with them every day. You should give them like some time to fly around, but they're generally quite independent. They don't really demand like constant attention. They won't roam around like disturbing things because they're in the cage. Unlike dogs and cats. Also, I think they can fly, so that's quite cool. Like having a living thing that can fly in your house that's not a cockroach or something. So that's great. And yeah, I mean they can talk and they can sing, so that's also a plus. Therefore, bird.
Okay, last thing. Is there anything you'd like to share with our audiences?
No, just keep reading. Keep reading good things. Keep reviewing things. I think that helps. And review things with some thought and not just for Instagram. Yes.
You have any recommendations?
I'll just tell you what I've read that I've liked. Yeah, I've been reading, I've just finished this book by Emily Berry, who's like a UK poet, called Unexhausted Time. The Guardian described her way of writing poetry as incendiary, which I think is correct. It will blow your mind, I think. It's just a way of writing poetry that I've not seen before. Emily Berry.
So that was it. Thank you for listening to our conversation with Daryl Lim, and we hope you learned a thing or two. Personally, I went away being able to appreciate anything but human on a much deeper level. Initially, I found the text alienating and confounding. Now I find myself revisiting certain works, fascinated by the words and images used. My personal favorite line would be, "Sorry, I tried to reach you with outdated technology. Forgive me." Anyways, stay tuned and have a good day. Bye.
Bye everyone.
Bye.